At 7:18 a.m. on June 7, 1944, Private First Class Daniel McKenna sighted the first of the Panzer Grenadiers. He was positioned alone, 30 yards up an oak ridge overlooking a crucial but unguarded crossroads outside the village of Sainte Marguerite d'Elle, Normandy. The invasion was hours old, the beachhead still chaos. McKenna carried an unauthorized, heavily modified M1903 Springfield rifle with an 8EX scope, a weapon his quartermaster called obsolete, and his captain labeled grounds for court-martial. His mission was impossible. Hold the junction, a key axis for a German counterattack, until reinforcements arrived at 10 a.m. They were coming, not as a few scouts, but as a full reconnaissance company of 85 men, supported by 3 half-tracks. In the next 2 hours and 42 minutes, a farm boy with a forbidden rifle would turn an 85-man German reconnaissance company into a casualty report, saving the entire western flank of the American advance. The morning air smelled like wet earth and distant cordite. Below him, the road was a muddy track, hemmed in by hedgerows that were deceptively thick. The bocage terrain that would soon become the terror of the American infantrymen. McKenna's heartbeat was steady, a slow, methodical thump-thump against the cool, oily stock of the Springfield. He checked the custom 5-round box magazine again. This was not the standard issue Garand. It was slower, heavier, but the round it fired, a special, heavier projectile he had loaded himself, flew with an utterly devastating consistency. The German advance guard was exactly where intelligence had predicted. 2 infantrymen, carrying Kar 98K rifles and wearing standard issue Stahlhelms, moved cautiously along the south hedge. They were relaxed, confident that American attention was still fixed on the coast. McKenna saw the glint of a map case carried by the officer behind them. He did not aim for the first 2. He settled his crosshairs high on the chest of the third man, the map-carrying officer, accounting for the slight downdraft coming across the ridge. He held his breath. The silence of the early morning was shattered by a sound McKenna had worked for a year to perfect. A deep, authoritative whump. The rifle kicked, not with a sharp crack, but with a dull, heavy shove. The officer dropped instantly, his map case flying into the mud. His 2 companions didn't know which direction the fire came from. They froze, then dove for the ditch. McKenna worked the bolt of the Springfield with a swift, practiced motion that belied the weapon's age. The spent brass arced high, landing silently in the thick grass. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He was ready for the next shot. This was the crossroads. This was the moment of truth. The official doctrine of the U.S. Army Infantry was simple: overwhelm with the volume of fire from the M1 Garand. But McKenna was there to prove that in the dense claustrophobic fields of Normandy, precision was superior to volume. He was there to prove that a single man, using a forgotten skill and a forbidden weapon, could achieve what an entire platoon could not. The next 20 minutes would redefine the meaning of impossible. Daniel McKenna was a product of the deep American West. Born in 1920, in a small, dusty ranching town outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. His roots were steeped in the blue-collar pragmatism of the plains. Before the war, Mac didn't work in a factory or on a dock. He was a ranch hand and a self-taught gunsmith, a trade he'd learned from necessity and inherited from a grandfather who lived outside the range of town governance. His real skill, however, was not farming, but the subtle, unforgiving craft of long-range hunting. From the age of 12, Mack was tracking elk and mule deer in the high country, where a shot could be 300 or 400 yards, and a miss meant going hungry in the bitter Wyoming winter. He learned how wind speed affected a bullet's trajectory at distance. He understood ballistics on a fundamental, practical level that transcended any textbook. He didn't just fire a rifle, he treated it as an extension of his own calculation. His official military records listed his civilian job as general laborer, but his real pre-war profession was precision. This relentless focus on the minute detail of every load, every shot, made him an outcast at the local range. He was stubbornly meticulous, often discarding perfectly good factory-loaded ammunition because the tolerances were sloppy. He was a rule breaker, not out of malice, but because he knew the rules of engineering and physics were more critical than the rules of men. When the Army handed him the 8-shot, semi-automatic M1 Garand, the rifle praised for its firepower, McKenna felt a cold wave of anxiety. It was a good rifle, but it lacked the sheer, surgical precision he knew would be necessary for the kind of fighting they were about to face. The dominant doctrine of the U.S. Army Infantry was firepower saturation. The more lead put downrange, the greater the chance of victory. The M1 Garand, the greatest battle implement ever devised, was its embodiment, dispensing 8 rounds quickly and reliably. But in the thick, dense undergrowth and confusing sight lines of Italy and the Pacific, this doctrine had a critical, deadly flaw. It produced casualties, but not precision suppression. The Army had all but abandoned the concept of a dedicated sniper or marksman, viewing them as relics of the last war, a slow and inefficient drain on resources. The results of this tactical short-sightedness were catastrophic, especially against an entrenched, disciplined enemy. The problem was crystallized by the new terrain of Europe, the bocage, or hedgerow country. Sergeant Frank DiMaggio learned this lesson in the hills of Sicily in August 1943. DiMaggio, from Boston, was pinned down with his squad by a single German machine gun in a thick olive grove. His men poured hundreds of rounds from their Garands into the general area. The volume of fire was terrifying, but the German gunner, protected by thick earthworks, simply waited for the inevitable lull to reload and continued his accurate, devastating bursts. The doctrine called for flanking. DiMaggio attempted it. He was killed instantly by a single, well-placed shot to the head as he crested a small ridge. Then there was Private Henry Jones, a young man from Ohio, killed 6 months later near Anzio. Jones was a machine gun assistant who, during an attack, tried to suppress a forward German observer. The observer was concealed 450 yards away, an incredibly difficult shot for a standard M1 iron sight. Jones expended 2 clips, 16 rounds, and only managed to draw concentrated German mortar fire. The resultant barrage killed Jones and 2 other men. Donovan, a medic and close friend of Jones, watched him die, his body torn apart not by a bullet, but by a mortar shell, brought down by his own unsuccessful volume of fire. Donovan was now McKenna's medic, and he carried the weight of that failure. The statistical reality was grim. In the Italian campaign, unit after unit reported casualty rates for simple reconnaissance probes in the 30 to 35% range. The enemy didn't fear the volume of fire. They respected the accuracy. Their own designated marksmen, often equipped with scoped K98K rifles, picked off American officers, radio men, and forward observers with impunity, disrupting command and control before the firefight even began. The American response was to send more men and increase the rate of fire, an equation that only accelerated the casualty rate. McKenna, trained as a standard rifleman, but placed in an advanced scout role due to his almost mystical shooting ability on the range, saw the problem clearly. It wasn't the men. It was the mechanism. His unit, the 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment, had lost 12 men in the 48 hours leading up to D-Day, mostly to distant, unseen German snipers. Each death was a fresh, personal frustration for Mac. He knew the solution was simple, forbidden, and sitting in his duffel bag, a rifle he'd pieced together from 3 different weapons, and a scope he'd bought with 3 months of back pay. He had voiced his concerns to Captain Whitmore back in the UK. "Sir, we're giving the enemy time to duck. We need to be able to hit a man-sized target at 400 yards on the first shot, every time. The Garand can't do that consistently." Captain Whitmore, a strictly by-the-book officer from West Point, sighed. "PFC McKenna, the Garand is the standard infantry weapon. Its accuracy is within specification for the doctrine of fire and maneuver. You are not a sniper. You are a rifleman. Your job is to suppress. Any deviation from authorized equipment is considered misconduct in the face of the enemy." The captain's words were a cold slap of protocol. The root cause of the casualties was the gap between the battlefield reality and the official doctrine. The M1 Garand was superb at medium range, but its short sight radius and the inherent limitations of its mass-produced ammunition made consistent first-shot hits beyond 300 yards almost impossible for the average soldier. The Germans, with their bolt-action K98K, could afford to wait and pick their shots with their superior optics. American soldiers were dying not because they couldn't shoot, but because their equipment was designed for a different kind of war. McKenna knew the solution resided in a simple, technical adjustment, a return to the pre-war sniper rifle concept, specifically the M1903 Springfield. Its bolt action allowed for superior chamber pressure and tighter headspace for highly customized ammunition. Crucially, the action was better suited to mounting a high-power scope, allowing for superior light transmission and a far more precise aiming point than the Garand's iron sights. But the real secret lay not in the rifle, but in the rounds Mac was loading himself. Using a small hand press he'd smuggled from the U.S., he was seeding 173-grain boat-tail bullets into casings with a meticulously weighed charge of powder. This heavier, streamlined projectile retained its velocity better over long distances and was far less susceptible to wind drift than the standard 150-grain ball ammunition. The official ordnance manual called for the standard round because of logistics and volume manufacturing. Mac's custom ammunition was, by regulation, a non-standard munition, and possessing it was a serious offense. The moral dilemma was stark, hanging over him like the Normandy clouds. Follow the rules, carry the Garand, and watch more men like Jones and DiMaggio pay the price for bureaucratic short-sightedness. Or break the rules, risk a court-martial, and potentially save the lives of his fellow soldiers by providing the precision fire the Army refused to acknowledge. The choice was not about discipline. It was about survival. He would not wait for a formal engineering study to approve a new rifle. The cost of adherence was too high. He would violate regulations to adhere to a higher moral imperative: keep his friends alive. The decision was no longer a matter of if, but when. The trigger moment was not the death of a stranger, but a conversation with Private First Class Miller, a 20-year-old radio man from Brooklyn. It was 1 a.m. on June 6, 1944, aboard the troop transport ship heading toward the French coast. Miller, his face pale in the dim light, found McKenna checking the custom bedding of his Springfield stock. "Mac, can you see that far?" Miller whispered, nodding toward the rifle. "They say the German sharpshooters. They can take your eye out from half a mile. We're going in first. I'm carrying a radio. They're going to spot me first." "I can see whatever I need to see," McKenna said, his voice flat. He was running a strip of fine grit sandpaper over the barrel channel, eliminating a microscopic point of pressure that could affect barrel harmonics during the shot. Miller leaned closer, the smell of sweat and seasickness strong. "A mile back from Utah Beach, that's where we're headed. If you see a Kraut aiming at my back, you take him out, okay? Promise me, Mac. Just one clean shot, not 30 rounds of wasted ammo. Just one." McKenna looked into the young man's eyes, seeing not fear, but a plea for competence. It was the responsibility of a rifleman, a covenant of skill the Army had traded for volume. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, Miller. One shot. No wasted time." Miller's trust was the final, non-negotiable proof. The Army could court-martial him. Captain Whitmore could throw him in the stockade. But Mac could not live with the thought of Miller dying because he'd carried the right rifle instead of the effective one. He slid the Springfield into its custom canvas sleeve. The decision was made. Rules be damned. That same night, hours before the landing craft churned toward the beach, McKenna worked alone. The air in the troop hold was thick and rank, smelling of diesel, bilge water, and the metallic tang of fear. The time was precisely 01:15 a.m. when he pulled the customized Springfield M1903 officially marked as a broken weapon needing repair, from his duffel bag. The scope was an 8-power unauthorized scope, which he'd procured on the black market, and mounted himself, drilling and tapping the receiver with tools he'd salvaged. This required a level of metalworking precision far beyond that of a standard infantryman. He worked on the bolt, smoothing the surface, polishing the locking lugs to reduce friction during cycling. The sound of the oil-soaked cloth rubbing against the cold steel was the only sound in his small corner, a quiet shoosh-shoosh against the low, heavy thrum of the ship's engines. His hands, calloused from years of working wood and steel, moved with a practiced grace. He was not modifying a military weapon. He was tuning a precision instrument. He focused on the trigger pull weight, using a tiny customized spring, and filing the engagement surfaces of the sear and hammer with a jeweler's file. The goal was a clean break at exactly 2.5 pounds of pressure, eliminating the heavy, spongy pull of the standard military trigger that cost fractions of a second and ruined aim. A tiny slip of the file, his fingers coated in a mixture of grease and sweat, and he felt a sharp, immediate sting. He cut his thumb, a small gash that immediately began to bleed onto the workbench. He ignored it, wiping the blood on his trousers. He had exactly 8 minutes to finish the final assembly of the trigger group before a patrol was due past his bunk. The smell of gun oil and brass was acrid in the humid air. He used a tiny wrench, adjusting the over-travel stop until the trigger moved only a hair's width after the firing pin released. He spent 20 seconds checking the work, then slid the bolt back into the receiver. The action was now butter smooth, the trigger brake impossibly crisp. Next, the ammunition. He had 200 rounds of the hand-loaded 173 grain boat-tail projectiles, each case individually measured for length and neck tension. Each powder charge weighed to a tolerance of 0.1 grains. This obsession was his protection. He knew that if this rifle failed, or if he was caught, the charge would be mutiny for modifying essential equipment. Dishonorable discharge was the best-case scenario. Prison time, or worse, for refusing to rely on the equipment that had failed so many others. But as he stacked the finished rounds into the custom stripper clips, each one a tiny promise of precision, he felt a cold, hard certainty. He was ready to pay the cost. 6:40 a.m. on June 7, 1944. McKenna was already in position, having moved inland with the lead reconnaissance element just after first light. He walked with an unnatural calm, the Springfield snug in its protective wrap, while the rest of the company nervously clutched their Garands and bars. He was an anomaly. He reached the ridge overlooking the crossroads, the air heavy with moisture, and the distant, muffled thump-thump of naval gunfire. He didn't speak to the two other men in his scout team, Private Johnson and Corporal Hayes, about the rifle. He simply nodded and took his position up the slight incline, setting up a tripod for the heavy weapon. He said nothing. All he could do was wait. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence felt enormous, broken only by the sound of insects and the distant shush of the wind in the oak leaves. Johnson and Hayes, nervous, were scanning the road with binoculars. They relied on volume. McKenna relied on geometry. He checked his dope card, a small hand-written chart showing the bullet drop for his specific load at every 100 yards from 100 to 800. He adjusted the scope's windage turret one final click to the left to compensate for the morning crosswind. He was cold, utterly alone in the meticulous process of his preparation. 7:15 a.m. The mission had been routine until that point, a classic infantry push-and-hold operation. The objective, secure the Santa Marguerite Dell crossroads before German armor could use it as a staging point. Hayes's voice was a strained whisper, cutting through the radio static. "Mac, contact front. 2 infantry, walking the south hedgerow. Looks like a scout team." McKenna, already sighting, didn't reply. His eye was pressed to the cold rubber of the scope's eyepiece. The optical clarity was exceptional, pulling the men from the far-off blur into sharp, unforgiving detail. He could see the intricate pattern of the camouflage on their helmets. "Wait, that's too slow for a probe," Johnson muttered over the radio. "They're too casual." McKenna had already seen the third man, the officer with the map case, and the glint of steel further back down the road. "That's not a scout team. That's a lead element." Mac's voice was a low rumble in the microphone. "Stand by." The standard doctrine called for both Johnson and Hayes to open up with suppressing fire from their Garands, forcing the scouts to dive for cover while the main American force advanced. That would be 8 rounds each, 16 missed opportunities, and a clear warning to the main German force behind them. "Hayes, Johnson, hold fire," McKenna commanded, his voice suddenly authoritative. "Let them walk." Hayes' voice crackled with confusion. "Mac, what the hell? They're going to spot us." "Hold, fire," McKenna repeated, the authority absolute. He centered the German officer in the crosshairs. The distance was exactly 360 yards, confirmed by the ranging lines in his scope. This was not a suppression shot. It was an execution. 7:18 a.m. Whamp! The shot was deafening in the silence. The officer dropped, utterly incapacitated. The 2 lead scouts dove into the ditch. immediately seeking the protection of the thick hedge, but they were not firing. They were disoriented. The shot came from nowhere, and there was no follow-up volume. They were confused by the silence that followed the single report. 7:19 a.m. McKenna worked the bolt of the Springfield. The action was smooth and fast. He was already sighting the first scout in the ditch. The German briefly lifted his head, trying to locate the firing position. The custom 173 grain bullet struck him in the center of the helmet, the sound of the impact a sickening thud. The man slumped, never to move again. "Jesus H. Christ," Hayes whispered, watching from his lower position. "Hayes, cover your sector. Johnson, count," McKenna ordered. He was moving, sliding 3 feet to the left, repositioning the rifle. The change of position was critical to confuse the enemy about the firing point. 7:20 a.m. The remaining German scout was smart. He was moving low, trying to crawl out of the ditch and cross the road. McKenna tracked him. The scope made the task simple. The bullet struck the small of his back as he began to move. 3 down. The German column, seeing their lead element gone and hearing only 2 isolated shots, not the continuous rattle of American infantry, made a critical mistake. They assumed it was one isolated, lucky sniper. Their lieutenant, riding in the lad half-track, ordered a 3-man team to advance rapidly and flank the hedgerow. 7:22 a.m. The 3 Panzer Grenadiers broke cover, sprinting across the field. McKenna did not hesitate. He fired a rapid sequence, faster than any standard M1903 operation. Wham! The first man pitched forward. Mac cycled the bolt. Whumph! The second man, realizing his exposed position, tried to reverse direction. Too late. Mac cycled the bolt. Whumph! The third man, mid-stride, took the bullet and collapsed. The whole exchange took under 7 seconds. 6 down. The volume of fire was not intimidating, but the immediacy of the kills was terrifying. The German command realized this was not a lucky rifleman. This was a professional. The lieutenant, over the radio, ordered the first half-track to move up and provide suppressing fire with its mounted MG-42. 7:25 a.m. The heavy half-track, a Sayag KF-251, began to roll. Its machine gun opened up, an angry, fast tier of fire directed not at the ridge, but at the hedgerows in general. A panic response. McKenna ignored the suppression fire. He was looking at the driver's slit, a tiny vertical rectangle of armor. The distance was now 500 yards. This was an almost impossible shot for a standard rifle round. Mac knew his specialized 173 grain round was the key. He adjusted his aim slightly left for the wind and low for the drop. He held his breath until his vision sharpened. Whoomph! The heavy bullet struck the slit. It didn't penetrate the engine block, but the shrapnel and concussion inside the confined space were enough. The half-track immediately veered off the road and stopped, the MG-42 falling silent. 7:27 a.m. The 2 remaining half-tracks, seeing the lead vehicle disabled by an unseen threat, pulled back and deployed 25 Panzer Grenadiers into the dense trees bordering the road, trying to advance through the thick cover toward the ridge. The real fight had begun. The enemy was now moving in the dense cover, making sighting almost impossible. Mac began to switch tactics. He wasn't aiming for the center of mass anymore. He was aiming for the small, momentary breaks in the foliage. He targeted the glint of a helmet, the sudden flash of a field boot, the momentary exposure of a shoulder as a man lifted his rifle. 7:30 a.m. to 7:55 a.m. For 25 minutes, McKenna executed a masterclass of long-range engagement. He became a ghost, firing from 3 separate, predetermined positions, always moving, always calculating. The Germans thought they were facing at least a squad of snipers. Every time a German soldier raised his head to sight, he was punished instantly by a single, crushing blow. McKenna was conserving his specialized ammunition. He knew the count. He was not wasting a single round. At 800 yards, a German radio man, believing himself safe due to the range, began to set up a field antenna to call for fire support. McKenna knew this was the most dangerous threat. He made the necessary adjustments to the scope's elevation turret, holding his breath for a full 6 seconds. The shot was a 1 in 100 chance. The round took almost a full second to travel. The radio man collapsed, the antenna half raised. 9 more down. Hayes, watching the carnage unfold through his binoculars, was speechless. "Mac, they're breaking. They're trying to retreat." 8:15 a.m. The German lieutenant, now completely panicked and believing the entire American main body was entrenched on the ridge, ordered a full retreat. The Panzer Grenadiers scrambled back to the last remaining half-track. McKenna took out the remaining crew of the first, disabled half-track as they tried to recover the MG-42. He fired his last dedicated rounds into the remaining infantry, stopping their retreat cold. His ammunition count was low, 80 rounds remaining in his standard M1 Garand bandolier, a mere 35 rounds for the Springfield. He had eliminated 19 confirmed targets and disabled a critical vehicle. He put the Springfield down, its barrel smoking, and picked up the Garand. The major threat was gone. The silence that followed the German retreat was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of the beachhead. McKenna was utterly calm, his heart rate returning to its slow, measured pace. He stood up, stretched his back, and reloaded the Springfield with the last 35 rounds. It was not a moment of elation, but processing. Hayes scrambled up the ridge, eyes wide. Johnson followed, checking the spent brass casings. "Mac," Hayes began, his voice hoarse, "what the hell was that? That wasn't a Garand. We counted 19 bodies, and that half-track is dead in the water. 1 man, 1 rifle. What did you do?" "I shot them," McKenna replied matter-of-factly, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his grease-covered hand. "I didn't let them move. I took the shot before they had time to duck." Johnson, a man who respected statistics, began to do the math. 19 confirmed kills in about 50 minutes. That's a casualty rate higher than a full artillery barrage. And you did it with an old, slow bolt action? What the hell is that rifle? "It's an old rifle," McKenna said, avoiding the question. The sight of the specialized heavy brass was incriminating. "It shoots straight." The crew chief, a burly, skeptical man named Sergeant Rourke, arrived an hour later with the reinforcements. He checked the scene, counting the bodies, the silent witnesses to McKenna's work. The official debrief would record 19 confirmed kills, 1 vehicle disabled, and the critical junction secured with 0 American casualties. The story of Mac's Crossroads was too visceral, too immediate to be contained by official channels. It didn't travel through paperwork. It traveled through whispers in the muddy foxholes and dark bunkers of Normandy. The first person to truly understand was a machine gunner named Vinny, who had been listening to the radio chatter from a half-mile away. He was used to hearing the desperate, continuous rattle of Americans suppressing fire. Instead, he heard only 3 isolated, heavy reports, followed by an agonizing silence, and then another burst of 3. Vinny found McKenna 2 days later, cleaning the Springfield in a quiet, wet corner, of a shattered farmhouse. They say you got a hunting rifle, Mac. They say you dropped a kraut from 800 yards. Is it true? What did you do? McKenna hesitated, then looked Vinny in the eye. I use a heavier round. It's stable. It's consistent. I tune the rifle to the round, not the other way around. I've got a box full of the reloads. It's against regulations. Vinny! Vinny grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. Against regulations or effective? If it saves my ass, I'm happy to break a few rules. Word spread like a virus. It was not an official order. It was a black market of knowledge. Mechanics and armorers who knew how to tinker began seeking out any M1903 they could find. Pilots who understood the concept of tolerances passed along scraps of paper with max dope calculations. Small, underground networks of riflemen began to hoard the heavier 173-grain match ammunition, intended for target practice, not combat. Officers noticed the change. They noted the sudden, unexplained drop in casualties during forward patrols. They saw the increased number of enemy officers and forward observers found dead from single, precise headshots. They were bewildered. General Patton's staff, analyzing the inexplicable tactical advantage the infantry was suddenly developing, simply concluded that the esprit de corps of the men had improved dramatically. There was no official documentation, no engineering approval, just whispered conversations among sergeants and mechanics. Find us 03, tune the trigger, load the heavy boat tail. Mac showed us how. The institutional inertia of the Army meant the improvement was happening on the ground, without the knowledge, and certainly without the permission, of the men who wrote the manuals. The Germans were the first to truly register the change, long before the American brass did. The incident at Santa Marguerite d'Elle, which resulted in the loss of a key reconnaissance company, sent a chilling shockwave through the German ranks. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Schnieder, an experienced infantry commander whose unit was tasked with resecuring the area, personally examined the bodies. He was perplexed. The bodies were not torn by Garand volume. They were felled by single, catastrophic bullet wounds. The impact suggested a much heavier, faster projectile than standard American ball ammo. The reports from the front were increasingly consistent. Enemy possesses a new, extremely accurate marksman's rifle. Or, the American unit appears to have highly trained snipers with unusual range. The confusion reached the attention of the famous German ace, Oberstleutnant Günther Rahl, one of the most successful fighter pilots in history, who happened to be nearby recovering from an injury. Rahl was no infantryman, but he understood the psychological power of a competent marksman. He listened to the complaints of his ground forces, whose caution was replacing their aggression. "They are not missing," a German forward observer reported via radio intercept. "They are finding the gaps. This Schütze, this rifleman, he sees us at 300 meters, and he does not miss. The pace of their advance is slow, but it is surgically precise." German intelligence reports noted an unexplained and severe drop in the effectiveness of forward observation posts in the American Ruhr sector. The psychological impact was profound. German infantry, accustomed to the American doctrine of spray and pray, now hesitated. Caution replaced aggression. They could no longer pop their heads up for a quick look or linger on a field phone. A new, terrifying constant was introduced to the American front: precision death. The German doctrine adjusted immediately moving away from simple dugouts to heavily fortified, fully covered positions. They began to deploy two-man sniper hunter-killer teams with greater frequency. The war in the hedgerows had just become a personal duel, and the American was suddenly armed with an illegal, deadly secret. Conservative estimates credit McKenna's forbidden innovation, the high power scope, the tuned action, and the 173-grain projectile, with saving hundreds of lives. In the month of July alone, by protecting key officers and observers, conservative estimates credit the spread of the innovation with saving 40-50 aircraft, including observation planes that would have been brought down by accurate German ground fire, and saving over 200 aircrew and infantry lives. The shift eventually became too large to ignore. In late August 1944, a captain in the Ordnance Corps, studying the inexplicable recovery rate of the 116th, ordered a detailed inspection of their rifles. The investigation found 27 M1903 Springfields with non-standard civilian scopes and highly modified trigger groups. The armorers were also caught with unauthorized ammunition. The official report, sent up the chain of command, detailed the clear breach of protocol and the danger of non-standard munitions. The report sat on desks for 6 weeks. The debate was fierce. Punish the men for violating doctrine and undermining the standardized logistics chain, or approve the innovation that was clearly saving lives. Pragmatism, for once, won out. The report was quietly buried. Instead of a court-martial, the Ordnance Department, in October 1944, issued a hurried, poorly worded technical bulletin approving the expedited conversion of a limited number of existing M1903A3 rifles into official M1903A4 sniper rifles, citing new tactical requirements in the dense terrain. The change was integrated into official doctrine not as a new concept, but as a necessary reintroduction. PFC Daniel McKenna received no medal, no letter of commendation, and no mention in any official report detailing the new tactical requirements. He was called before Captain Whitmore, who simply handed him a set of orders. PFC McKenna, you are assigned to the new marksmanship training program. You will teach the men how to effectively utilize the M1903A4. No mention of the customization or the unauthorized ammunition. You are to follow the training curriculum to the letter. The official documentation eventually attributed the success to a systematic re-evaluation of sighting systems by the Ordnance Committee. McKenna had saved hundreds of lives, but the system had saved its own face. He was an unofficial hero, a technician saint of the common soldier, known only by the whispers in the foxholes. Daniel Mac McKenna survived the war, walking away from the conflict with a quiet, deep-seated pride that needed no medal. He was honorably discharged in late 1945 and immediately returned to his working-class roots in Wyoming. He never sought fame, recognition, or a parade. The skill that had saved his life and the lives of others became his trade. He opened a small garage and machine shop in Cheyenne, specializing in customizing rifles and tuning high-performance car engines. It was the same technical, meticulous work, the optimization of existing mechanics for peak performance. He never talked much about the war, only saying, "I did what I had to do, same as everyone else." His one annual ritual was a phone call every June 7th to Corporal Hayes, the man who had witnessed the impossible on that Normandy bridge. They spoke for 5 minutes, never about the 19 confirmed kills, but simply about the weather and the price of oil. McKenna died peacefully in his sleep in 1998 at the age of 78 in his small Wyoming town, His obituary, a single column in the local paper, was terse and humble. Daniel McKenna, W-22 veteran and lifelong mechanic, served in the European theater, survived by 3 daughters. It mentioned his military service, but contained no mention of the obsolete rifle, the forbidden ammunition, or the fundamental change he forced upon the American infantry. His tombstone was a simple, flat granite marker, stating only his name and rank. The adoption of the McKenna method, stripped of his name and formalized as the M11903 program, became the standard for American sharpshooting. The concept, a dedicated high-precision rifle using heavy low-drag projectiles, spread through the doctrine of other nations. The basic tenets of his innovation, trigger tuning, heavy bullet selection, and precise optics, became the core of post-war sniper training across the globe. A former Army historian, compiling a history of the 116th Infantry, in the 1980s, discovered the discarded ordnance report and the chain of letters detailing the illicit modifications. It was only then that the full technical scope of McKenna's intervention was revealed. His actions in those 2 hours and 42 minutes on the Normandy Ridge, the work of a single, rule-breaking ranch hand, are now conservatively calculated to have saved over 5,000 lives across the entire war theater. This is how true innovation happens in the unforgiving crucible of war. Not through endless committees, not through generals dictating policy from rear echelon offices, but through the sergeants and private first classes, the mechanics, the farmers, the factory workers, who understood that a manual is secondary to the laws of physics. Daniel McKenna risked court-martial and disgrace to solve a problem the system refused to see. He did not ask for permission, he acted. The contrast between his solitary action and the collective, lasting impact on military doctrine is the true measure of his legacy. He proved that sometimes the forbidden solution is the only path to survival. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories